License and registration. You want to tell me where you got this car from?
Excuse me?
I said, where'd you get the car? This your vehicle? You got proof this belongs to you?
I've owned this car for 3 years, officer.
Uh-huh. What are you doing out here this late? You from around here, or...?
The quiet Tuesday night of August 31st, 2003, was peaceful when Commander David Richardson, a 23-year veteran of California law enforcement, drove home after working late reviewing case reports in his office at Oakland Police Department headquarters. It was 11:00 p.m. when he crossed into neighboring jurisdiction on his usual route, driving his personal sedan through a silent residential neighborhood, completely unaware a patrol car had fallen in behind him and that a rookie officer was about to make a career mistake by stopping him without reason. What happened in the next 22 minutes would be captured by the officer's body camera and become legendary within law enforcement circles as a perfect example of why officers should never make stops based on assumptions about who belonged in certain vehicles or neighborhoods. The arrival of the backup officer and his visible shock at recognizing who had been stopped would transform a routine traffic stop into a humbling lesson the rookie officer would never forget. David Richardson was 51 years old and had risen through the ranks from patrol officer to detective to lieutenant to captain to finally commander, one of the highest positions in the department hierarchy. He supervised over 200 officers, was responsible for entire division operations, and had earned a reputation as a fair but demanding leader who insisted his officers follow both the letter and spirit of the law. Richardson was also known for not tolerating racial profiling or pretextual stops, having implemented multiple policy reforms during his tenure focused on ensuring stops were based on observable violations rather than assumptions about drivers. He drove a modest 4-year-old Toyota Camry sedan, preferring to spend his salary on his children's education rather than flashy vehicles, and often wore casual clothes when working late instead of full uniform. The officer who would stop Richardson that night was Jake Morris, a 24-year-old recruit who had graduated from the academy just 7 months earlier and was currently in his probationary period working solo on night patrols. Morrison had shown troubling signs during his field training, including a tendency to make stops based on gut feeling rather than specific violations and an inability to clearly articulate reasonable suspicion when questioned by training officers. He had received 2 written warnings during his probationary period for making traffic stops without adequate justification, but hadn't yet faced consequences serious enough to change his behavior. Morrison had also expressed in informal conversations with fellow recruits that he believed certain types of people in certain vehicles in certain areas deserved extra scrutiny, revealing implicit bias that should have been addressed during training. That specific night, Morrison was patrolling an upper, middle-class residential neighborhood when he saw Richardson's Camry passing by. There was nothing objectively suspicious about the vehicle. It was obeying all traffic laws, maintaining appropriate speed, signaling lane changes, and operating with all lights functioning properly. But Morrison saw a middle-aged black man driving an older sedan through a predominantly white neighborhood late at night and apparently decided to investigate. He had no traffic violation to justify a stop, no articulable reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, no legitimate legal reason for contact. He simply made an assumption based on race and appearance that something seemed out of place and that he should check it out. Morrison activated his emergency lights and signaled for Richardson to pull over. Richardson, who had literally trained hundreds of officers during his career and recognized a pretextual stop when he experienced one, briefly considered identifying himself immediately to avoid wasting time. But he decided to let the stop proceed. Curious about what justification Morrison would invent and recognizing this could serve as a valuable teaching moment, Richardson signaled, slowed down, and carefully pulled to the side of the road, his hands immediately going to the top of the steering wheel in visible position as he had taught countless people to do during traffic stops. He watched Morrison through his rearview mirror, noting the young officer's cautious body language as he approached, hand near his weapon in a posture suggesting he expected a potentially dangerous situation rather than a routine traffic stop of a law-abiding driver. Morrison activated his body camera per protocol and approached the driver's window. Richardson lowered his window and waited, his face calm but his eyes watching Morrison's every movement with the professional assessment of someone who had conducted thousands of traffic stops and knew exactly how they should be handled. Morrison shined his flashlight in Richardson's face, then swept the vehicle interior, clearly looking for anything, that would justify his decision to make this stop. The body camera captured everything: the clean vehicle interior, Richardson sitting calmly with hands on the wheel, no signs of any illegal activity or safety concerns. Morrison began his interrogation by asking Richardson if he knew why he had been stopped. Richardson, who had taught officers countless times never to ask that question because it put the burden on the driver to guess the officer's reasons, responded calmly that no, he didn't know why he had been stopped and would like the officer to articulate the reason. Morrison stumbled slightly, then said Richardson had changed lanes without signaling several blocks back. Richardson knew this was false. He had specifically noticed Morrison behind him and had been extra careful about signaling every movement. But he simply observed he always signaled his lane changes and asked if Morrison had dashcam footage of the alleged violation. Morrison changed subjects without answering the dashcam question. Morrison then asked for Richardson's driver's license and registration. Richardson asked politely if Morrison could first explain the legal basis for the stop, noting that if there was no actual traffic violation, there was no grounds for demanding documents. Morrison, apparently not expecting to be challenged on basic procedure, said he had the right to check identification of any driver he stopped. Richardson responded that officers had the right to make stops based on observed violations or reasonable suspicion, but that drivers had the right to know why they were being detained. He asked again what specific violation Morrison had witnessed that justified the stop. The body camera captured Morrison becoming visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly realizing the driver knew the law better than he expected. Morrison tried to assert authority by saying questioning an officer during a traffic stop could be interpreted as obstruction. Richardson, whose patience was beginning to wear thin, but who maintained a professional tone, responded that asking legitimate questions about legal basis for detention wasn't obstruction under any reasonable interpretation of the law, and that he had a constitutional right to understand why he was being stopped. He also noted he had been completely cooperative, had pulled over promptly when signaled, kept his hands visible, and was simply exercising his right to request information about the stop. Morrison, apparently realizing his pretextual stop was falling apart, shifted tactics once again. Morrison asked if the vehicle belonged to Richardson, the tone suggesting he doubted a black man driving an older Camry at 11 p.m. could be the legitimate owner. The body camera captured the question clearly, preserving evidence of Morrison questioning vehicle ownership without any factual basis for doing so. Richardson responded yes, the vehicle was his. He had purchased it new 4 years earlier and had all appropriate registration. Morrison pressed, saying he needed to see proof of ownership, that Richardson needed to provide registration proving the vehicle belonged to him. Richardson noted he had just stated he had registration and would be happy to provide it once Morrison articulated legal reasonable suspicion for the stop, but that he wasn't providing documents in response to baseless demands based on assumptions about who could own certain vehicles. At this point, Morrison made a statement that would reveal exactly how deeply his racial assumptions were driving his actions. He said he was patrolling an expensive area and had the right to check on people who seemed out of place. The phrase, "out of place," echoed on the body camera recording, clear admission that Morrison was making stops based on who he thought belonged in certain neighborhoods rather than observed behavior or law violations. Richardson let the statement hang for a moment, then calmly asked what specifically seemed out of place about a driver obeying all traffic laws in a properly registered vehicle. Morrison couldn't articulate an answer beyond vague statements about the time of night and being cautious. Richardson decided he had seen enough of Morrison's judgment and decision-making process. He told Morrison he was a police officer, that he recognized a pretextual stop when he experienced one, and that Morrison had no articulable, reasonable suspicion for this stop beyond assumptions about race and class. He noted he had been completely respectful and cooperative despite being illegally detained, but that he wouldn't provide documents without proper legal justification. Morrison, clearly shocked by the revelation he had stopped a fellow officer, asked what department Richardson was from. Richardson responded he worked in law enforcement but had no obligation to reveal specific department or rank during an illegal traffic stop. Morrison, now visibly nervous and apparently realizing he had made a serious mistake, tried to backtrack. He said this was just a routine check, that he was just doing his job, that there was no intention to offend. Richardson cut him off, saying routine checks required reasonable suspicion or observation of a violation, neither of which Morrison had demonstrated. He also noted, doing his job didn't include stopping people based on assumptions about who belonged in certain neighborhoods. Morrison began apologizing, but Richardson said apologies were inadequate when an officer had demonstrated clear racial bias that likely affected multiple other stops Morrison had made. Morrison tried to end the stop, telling Richardson he was free to go, that this had been a misunderstanding. But Richardson wasn't willing to let this end so easily. He told Morrison he wanted Morrison's full name and badge number formally recorded, that he wanted confirmation all body camera footage would be preserved, and that he would be reporting this stop through appropriate channels. Morrison asked Richardson to reconsider, suggesting they could settle this between officers without involving supervisors. Richardson responded the reason racial profiling continued happening was precisely because officers tried to resolve misconduct between us, rather than demanding accountability through official processes. Morrison, clearly panicking as he realized the gravity of his situation, grabbed his radio and called for backup. He told dispatch he had a traffic stop with a possibly uncooperative individual who claimed to be a police officer, but refused to provide identification. The way Morrison characterized the situation was misleading. Richardson had been completely cooperative and had clearly explained why he wasn't providing documents without proper legal justification, but Morrison was apparently trying to create a narrative that made him look less culpable. Richardson heard the radio transmission and slowly shook his head, recognizing Morrison was now compounding his original misconduct with misrepresentation of facts to dispatch and responding officers. Richardson told Morrison he had just made his situation significantly worse by misrepresenting the facts over the radio, that the entire interaction was being captured by Morrison's body camera and would clearly show Richardson had been cooperative, and that Morrison had no legal basis for the stop. Morrison began protesting he was just following protocol by calling backup when a driver refused to provide identification. Richardson pointed out protocol required officers to have reasonable suspicion before demanding identification, that Morrison still hadn't articulated any violation or suspicious behavior, and that calling backup didn't change the fact the initial stop was illegal from the start. A second patrol car arrived within 5 minutes, driven by Senior Officer Marcus Webb, a 16-year veteran who had worked multiple shifts with Morrison during the recruit's probationary period. Webb exited his vehicle and walked toward the scene, his body language casual, suggesting he expected a routine situation. But when he got close enough to clearly see Richardson's face through the open window, his expression changed dramatically. His eyes widened, his steps hesitated, and he actually stopped walking for a moment before continuing more slowly toward the vehicle. Webb had worked under Richardson's command for 3 years before transferring to the neighboring department, and he recognized his former commander immediately. Webb approached Morrison and asked in a low voice what the hell was going on. Morrison began explaining he had stopped a vehicle for lane change without signaling, and that the driver was being difficult about providing identification. Before Morrison could finish, Webb cut him off and said 3 words that made Morrison's face go completely pale. Webb asked Morrison if he had any idea who he had just stopped. Morrison said no, the driver claimed to be a cop, but wouldn't provide details. Webb shook his head in disbelief, and what he said next was captured perfectly by Morrison's body camera. Webb told Morrison the man sitting in that vehicle was Commander David Richardson of the Oakland Police Department, that he supervised over 200 officers, that he had served for 23 years, and that he was known throughout the region as a leader who didn't tolerate racial profiling or pretextual stops. Webb also noted Richardson had been his commander for 3 years and was one of the most respected officers in all of Northern California law enforcement. The information hit Morrison like a freight truck, his face draining of color as the full implications of who he had stopped and how he had conducted the stop sank into his consciousness. He hadn't just stopped a fellow officer, he had stopped one of the most senior commanders in the region, and had done so in a manner that demonstrated blatant racial profiling. Webb immediately walked to Richardson's window and addressed him formally as commander, apologizing profusely for what had happened. Richardson, who knew Webb and respected his work, nodded in acknowledgement, but made clear this wasn't Webb's fault, and that apologies needed to come from Morrison and, more importantly, from the department through appropriate channels. Webb asked Richardson if he needed anything or if there was anything Webb could do. Richardson said he appreciated Webb responding, but what he needed was for Morrison to understand this wasn't about Richardson being a commander. It was about the fact Morrison had made a stop without reasonable suspicion based purely on racial assumptions. Webb turned to Morrison with an expression mixing anger and embarrassment. He asked Morrison what violation he had observed that justified stopping the commander's vehicle. Morrison repeated his claim about lane change without signaling. Webb asked if Morrison had dashcam evidence of this alleged violation. Morrison admitted no, that he hadn't activated dashcam before making the stop. Webb asked why not, given dashcam should be activated for all traffic stops. Morrison had no good answer. Webb then asked what else had caught Morrison's attention about the vehicle that justified a stop beyond the alleged signaling violation. Morrison began talking about the time of night and the area and checking on things that seemed out of place. Webb cut Morrison off mid-sentence and told him to stop digging the hole deeper. He pointed out Morrison had just admitted on body camera recording he made a stop based on things that seemed out of place, rather than observed violation, that this was admission of profiling, and that it was exactly the kind of behavior that got officers fired during probationary periods. Webb told Morrison he needed to return to his vehicle and make no additional statements without union representation present. Morrison tried to protest he was just doing his job and being cautious. Webb responded doing his job meant stopping people for actual violations, not for looking out of place in certain neighborhoods. Richardson, who had been observing the exchange between Webb and Morrison, finally spoke. He told Morrison he wanted Morrison to understand something fundamental. Richardson explained of the reason he hadn't identified himself immediately as a commander at the start of the stop was because he wanted to see how Morrison would conduct the stop when he thought he was dealing with an ordinary driver. Richardson noted that if he had been just a regular citizen instead of a high-ranking officer, Morrison might have escalated the situation even further, might have searched the vehicle without cause, might have arrested Richardson for refusing to provide identification during an illegal stop. The fact Richardson was a commander shouldn't change how Morrison treated him. Every driver deserved to have their rights respected regardless of their employment or status. Morrison tried to apologize again, saying he didn't mean to profile anyone, that he was just trying to keep the area safe. Richardson responded that intent mattered less than impact, that Morrison had clearly made this stop based on assumptions about who belonged in that neighborhood, rather than observed behavior, and that such policing didn't make communities safer, it made black people less safe because it subjected them to illegal detentions based purely on race. Richardson also noted he had trained hundreds of officers over his career and recognized signs of racial profiling when he saw them, and that everything about this stop, from the lack of initial violation to the questions about vehicle ownership to the comments about looking out of place, demonstrated bias Morrison needed to address if he wanted to continue in law enforcement. Webb suggested to Richardson they could handle this informally, that he would personally speak with Morrison's supervisor and ensure Morrison received additional retraining on racial profiling and constitutional rights. Richardson shook his head and said informal resolution was exactly how misconduct persisted unchecked, that this incident needed to be formally reported, properly investigated, and addressed through appropriate disciplinary processes. He noted that if Morrison was making pretextual stops like this, there were likely multiple other victims who didn't have the knowledge or resources to challenge his actions, and that allowing it to continue without accountability would be a failure to protect the public. Richardson finally provided his identification to Webb, not Morrison, making clear he was doing this as professional courtesy to Webb rather than submitting to Morrison's illegal demands. Webb examined Richardson's command identification and returned it with visible respect, then asked if Richardson planned to file a formal complaint. Richardson confirmed yes, he would be reporting this incident both to Morrison's immediate supervisor and to the department chief, and that he expected full investigation into Morrison's pattern of stops to determine if this was an isolated incident or part of larger problematic behavior. He also said he wanted all body camera footage preserved, including the radio transmission where Morrison had misrepresented the nature of the stop to dispatch. Webb assured Richardson he would personally ensure the footage was preserved and that he would provide his own statement as a witnessing officer about what he had observed upon arriving at the scene. Webb also offered to escort Richardson for the remainder of his trip home if he wanted to avoid possible additional stops, but Richardson declined, saying he shouldn't need an escort to drive safely through neighboring jurisdictions and that accepting such an arrangement would validate the idea black drivers needed special protection rather than simply requiring officers to follow the law. Richardson drove away from the scene, leaving Morrison standing by the roadside processing the reality he had just made a career mistake that would be impossible to undo. Morrison was instructed by Webb to return to the station immediately and report to the shift supervisor. During the drive back, Morrison apparently realized how seriously he had gotten himself into trouble because he called the union representative before even arriving at the station. When he arrived, his lieutenant had already been alerted by Webb about the incident and was waiting with an expression that communicated disbelief and anger. The body camera recording was immediately preserved and copied to multiple locations with documented chain of custody. The lieutenant listened to Morrison's explanation of the stop, then watched the body camera recording, and his expression grew progressively more serious as the video proceeded. The video showed everything in painful detail. Morrison stopping a vehicle without observable violation, asking questions about vehicle ownership without justification, admitting he was checking on people who seemed out of place, and then misrepresenting the situation over the radio when confronted about his lack of reasonable suspicion. Morrison's attempt to characterize Richardson as uncooperative was clearly contradicted by the recording, which showed Richardson being respectful and articulate in explaining his rights. Morrison's comment about checking people who seemed out of place was particularly damning. On video admission, he was making stops based on assumptions about who belonged in certain neighborhoods rather than observed behavior. The Internal Affairs Division was notified the following morning and opened a formal investigation. Investigators pulled Morrison's entire traffic stop history since he had begun solo patrols 7 months earlier. What they found confirmed exactly what Richardson had suspected. Morrison had a clear pattern of making pretextual stops, particularly of black motorists in predominantly white neighborhoods. In 7 months, Morrison had made 47 traffic stops. Of those 47 stops, 34 involved black motorists, despite black residents representing only 16% of the population in his patrol zone. Of stops involving white motorists, 92% resulted in verbal warnings without citation. Of stops involving black motorists, 71% resulted in requests to search vehicles, warrant checks, or citations. Investigators also reviewed Morrison's report narratives for his stops, looking at how he articulated reasonable suspicion. In multiple cases, his justifications were vague or inconsistent, erratic driving behavior that wasn't evident in dashcam videos when they existed. Vehicles matching descriptions, from theft reports that turned out to be completely different makes and models, suspicious bulges, or furtive movement that couldn't be verified through video evidence. In at least 8 cases, Morrison's narratives specifically mentioned drivers being in high-income areas or expensive neighborhoods as part of his justification for stops, suggesting he viewed black people in such areas as inherently suspicious. 3 of Morrison's previous stops had resulted in citizen complaints that were filed away without significant investigation. Investigators now reopened those complaints and contacted the complainants. All 3 described experiences remarkably similar to Richardson's. They being stopped without clear violation, questioned about vehicle ownership, subjected to questions about what they were doing in certain neighborhoods. None of the 3 had been cited or arrested, suggesting Morrison hadn't found any actual illegal activity. But all 3 described feeling racially profiled and humiliated by the experience. One of the complainants, a black physician who had been stopped while driving home from his hospital shift, had specifically mentioned in the complaint that Morrison had asked if the luxury vehicle belonged to him, mirroring exactly the question Morrison had asked Richardson. The investigation also revealed Morrison's field training officers had raised concerns about his stopping tendencies during his training period. One field evaluation report noted Morrison occasionally makes stops based on gut feeling rather than observable facts. and recommended additional training on articulating reasonable suspicion. Another report mentioned Morrison had expressed opinions about certain types of people deserving extra scrutiny during informal discussions, but these red flags hadn't resulted in significant intervention or corrective training before Morrison was released to solo patrol. Supervisors had essentially failed to address early warning signs of bias that had now escalated to a documented pattern of racial profiling. The internal investigation report was completed 3 weeks after Richardson's stop, and its findings were devastating both for Morrison and for the supervisors who had failed to address his early warning signs. Investigators determined Morrison had violated multiple departmental policies, including prohibitions against racial profiling, requirements to articulate reasonable suspicion before stops, standards of professional conduct, and prohibitions against misrepresenting facts in radio communications. The report specifically found Morrison had no legal basis to stop Richardson, that his questions about vehicle ownership demonstrated clear racial bias, that his admission about checking people who seemed out of place was direct confession of profiling, and that his characterization of the stop in radio transmission was misleading and designed to create a false narrative about Richardson's lack of cooperation. But the report went beyond the individual incident with Richardson to document a systemic pattern of misconduct. Investigators concluded Morrison had engaged in racial profiling from the start of his solo patrols, that supervisors had received warning signs during field training and through citizen complaints, but had failed to intervene adequately, and that the lack of proper oversight had allowed Morrison to operate for 7 months, developing a pattern of discriminatory behavior that eventually culminated in stopping one of the region's most senior commanders. The report noted that if Morrison could stop a commander without hesitation, based purely on race, he had likely stopped countless ordinary citizens under similar circumstances who didn't have the resources or knowledge to challenge his actions. The investigators' recommendation was immediate employment termination during probationary period, permanent revocation of police certification, and referral to the district attorney for possible criminal charges of oppressive official conduct. The report also recommended disciplinary action for 3 mid-level supervisors who had reviewed and filed away Morrison's previous citizen complaints without adequate investigation, and mandatory retraining for all field training officers on identifying and addressing signs of bias during probationary training periods. The police chief accepted all recommendations without hesitation, understanding defending Morrison would be both legally indefensible and disastrous for community relations. Morrison was officially fired 4 weeks after stopping Richards. His brief 7-month career in law enforcement ended by a pattern of racial profiling that had begun essentially from his first day of solo patrol and had continued unchecked until he made the spectacularly visible mistake of stopping a high-ranking commander. The State Board of Police Standards revoked his certification permanently with notation in his file indicating termination for misconduct involving racial profiling, ensuring he could never work as a law enforcement officer anywhere in California. The swiftness of the termination, just 4 weeks from the initial incident, reflected both the seriousness of the violations and the fact Morrison was still in probationary period, where departments had significantly greater discretion to fire officers without extensive appeal processes. The story leaked to local media within days of Morrison's firing, though specific details were initially limited due to the ongoing investigation. But when reporters began asking questions about a probationary officer being fired for stopping a commander, the story gained traction. News outlets reported, "Rookie officer fired after stopping police commander in pretextual stop," and "Racial profiling costs recruit's career who stopped senior officer." The narrative focused both on the fact Morrison had stopped a high-ranking commander and on a broader pattern of racial profiling the investigation had uncovered. Civil rights organizations issued statements praising Richardson for using the incident to force systemic accountability rather than simply accepting apologies and moving on. Richardson gave limited interview to local news outlet where he emphasized the issue wasn't about him personally, but about how many other drivers Morrison had illegally stopped who didn't have his position or knowledge to challenge the misconduct. He noted the data showed Morrison had disproportionately stopped black motorists and that each of those stops represented a violation of constitutional rights and perpetuation of trauma Black people experience from being treated as suspicious in their own neighborhoods. Richardson also praised the department's thorough investigation and willingness to fire Morrison, despite him still being in probationary period, but noted supervisors who had ignored early warning signs also needed to be held accountable for allowing the pattern to develop. The 3 supervisors who had filed away Morrison's previous citizen complaints faced disciplinary action ranging from 2-week unpaid suspensions to demotions in rank. One supervisor who had specifically dismissed the physician's complaint without adequate investigation was demoted from sergeant to senior officer, a significant loss of authority and pay. The department also implemented new protocol requiring all citizen complaints alleging racial profiling to be automatically forwarded to internal affairs for independent review rather than being handled solely at shift supervisor level. The policy change recognized line supervisors often had relationships with officers they supervised that could influence their judgment about whether complaints should be seriously investigated. Morrison's case became a widely discussed example within law enforcement circles about multiple issues. The importance of addressing signs of bias during field training before officers were released to solo patrols, the dangers of making stops based on assumptions about who belonged in certain neighborhoods, and the consequences of racial profiling even when victims were themselves law enforcement officers. The body camera video, though not made publicly available due to the ongoing investigation and Richardson's preference for privacy, was used extensively in police department training throughout California. Instructors paused the video at key moments when Morrison made a stop without observable violation, when he questioned vehicle ownership without justification, when he admitted checking people who seemed out of place, and when his misleading radio characterization was contradicted by video evidence. Morrison attempted to appeal his termination through the police union, but the union quickly determined the case was indefensible. The video evidence was too clear, the statistical pattern too obvious, and the fact he had stopped a high-ranking commander made it impossible to argue this was a minor error in judgment. The union recommended Morrison accept the termination and focus on finding a career in an unrelated field, rather than fighting through an appeal process that would likely result in the same conclusion, while generating additional negative publicity. Morrison followed the advice and withdrew his appeal, effectively ending any possibility of working in law enforcement again. Richardson did not file a civil lawsuit against Morrison or the department, a decision that surprised some observers given the clear case for rights violation he could have made. But Richardson explained in interviews that as a law enforcement commander, he understood real systemic change came not from individual settlements, but from policy reforms and cultural shifts within departments. He had accomplished what he sought. Morrison removed from law enforcement before he could victimize more people. Supervisors held accountable for ignoring warning signs, and policy changes implemented to prevent similar future cases. Suing for financial damages would have personalized the issue rather than keeping it focused on the broader systemic problem of racial profiling that affected countless people who would never receive settlements or public acknowledgement. The experience changed how Richardson approached training and supervision in his own department. He implemented a new program requiring all officers, regardless of rank, to periodically experience being stopped in training scenarios where actors played officers making pretextual stops. The program was designed to give officers first-hand perspective on how it felt to be stopped without justification, questioned about vehicle ownership, and treated with suspicion based purely on appearance. Some officers initially resisted what they saw as an uncomfortable exercise, but Richardson insisted discomfort was precisely the point, that officers needed to understand viscerally what they were doing to people when they made stops based on assumptions rather than facts. Richardson also became a frequent speaker at law enforcement conferences throughout California, sharing his experience of being stopped by Morrison as a teaching example about racial profiling and the importance of addressing bias during training. He emphasized in his speaking that the problem wasn't just Morrison as an individual, but systemic failures that allowed an officer with clear warning signs to be released to solo patrols. That allowed citizen complaints to be dismissed without investigation, and that created a culture where officers felt empowered to stop people based on who they thought belonged in certain spaces. His speeches resonated particularly because he spoke not as an outside victim criticizing law enforcement, but as a senior commander, working to improve the profession from within. The body camera video of the incident became one of the most requested training tools in California police academies. Though its use was carefully controlled to protect Richardson's privacy, departments had to sign specific agreements limiting how the video could be used and ensuring it wouldn't be made publicly available or shared outside official training contexts. Instructors used the video to teach multiple lessons: the importance of having articulable, reasonable suspicion before making stops, the dangers of allowing assumptions about race and class to drive law enforcement decisions, the consequences of misrepresenting facts in radio communication, and how implicit bias could blind officers to the obvious. As in Morrison's case of not recognizing his judgment about who seemed out of place was fundamentally based on race. Morrison disappeared from public life after his firing, his attempts to rebuild his career frustrated by the fact background checks for any security or law enforcement position would reveal his termination for racial profiling. He tried multiple jobs in private security, but employers invariably rejected him once they discovered the reason for his firing from the police department. Morrison eventually found work in a field completely unrelated to law enforcement or security. His police career aspiration permanently ended at 24 by a pattern of behavior he had never adequately recognized or addressed. Some people expressed sympathy for Morrison, suggesting a 24-year-old officer shouldn't have his entire life defined by 7 months of bad decisions. But others pointed out those 7 months had impacted countless victims who had been illegally stopped and treated as suspicious based purely on race. Marcus, the officer who had responded as backup and recognized Richardson, became a vocal advocate within his department for taking racial profiling complaints seriously and addressing bias during training. He used his own experience of witnessing the shock of realizing Morrison had stopped a commander as a teaching example about why officers needed to question their own assumptions about who looked suspicious or out of place. Webb also worked with Richardson to develop a joint training program where officers from multiple departments could learn about racial profiling from someone who had both experienced it as a victim and served as a senior leader working to combat it systemically. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond one officer's firing or one department's reforms. It became a reference point cited in discussions about probationary periods and the importance of using that time to identify and address officers with problematic patterns before they became permanent. The case demonstrated racial profiling wasn't just a problem with veteran officers with entrenched biases, but could appear in recruits from their first days of patrol, and that departments had a responsibility to identify and intervene early rather than waiting until patterns became so obvious they couldn't be ignored. The fact Morrison had stopped a commander made the story memorable, but the real lesson lay in the 33 other black motorists he had stopped without justification who never received attention or accountability. For black officers in law enforcement, Richardson's case offered validation of experiences many had but rarely discussed publicly. Multiple black officers shared their own stories of being stopped by fellow officers when out of uniform, of being questioned about whether vehicles belonged to them, of being treated with suspicion in their own neighborhood. Richardson's willingness to make his case public and use it to force systemic change encouraged other black officers to speak up about their experiences and advocate for reform. Some departments began implementing programs where black officers could share their experiences of racial profiling with fellow officers as part of implicit bias training. The 3 motorists whose previous complaints about Morrison had been filed away without investigation were contacted by the department and offered formal apologies. One of them, the physician who had been stopped returning from his hospital shift, accepted the department's invitation to speak at a training session about the impact of being racially profiled. He described how the stop had made him feel in his own community, how it had affected his perception of law enforcement, and how validating it had been to finally have his complaint taken seriously after investigation of Richardson's case revealed Morrison had a pattern of such conduct. His testimony was powerful precisely because he spoke not as an activist or outside critic, but as a respected professional who simply wanted to drive home from work without being treated as a criminal suspect. Richardson continued serving as commander for 5 more years before retiring with full honors after 28 years of service. During those final years, he focused particularly on mentoring young officers of color, helping them navigate the challenges of working in a profession where they could both be victims of racial profiling when out of uniform and be pressured to participate in such profiling when on duty. He emphasized to his mentees that being a black officer didn't mean they were immune to developing biases against their own communities, that pressure to conform to law enforcement culture could lead even officers of color to internalize and act on harmful stereotypes, and that they had a special responsibility to challenge racial profiling when they witnessed it in colleagues. Morrison's stop of Richardson on the night of August 31, 2003 had lasted only 22 minutes, but its reverberations continued for years through departmental policies, training programs, and conversations about how law enforcement could address racial profiling systemically rather than just reacting to individual incidents. The case demonstrated that not even senior commanders were immune to being stopped based on race. That probationary period was a critical window for identifying and addressing problematic officers before they became permanent, and that accountability required more than just firing individual officers. It required addressing supervisors who ignored warning signs and systems that allowed such patterns to develop unchecked. Richardson occasionally drove through that same area where Morrison had stopped him, sometimes deliberately choosing that route as a reminder of why his work mattered. He thought about the 36 black motorists Morrison had stopped during 7 months, about how many of them had experienced fear or humiliation or anger, about how many had filed complaints that were ignored, about how many had simply accepted it as one more indignity of driving while black they had to endure. He thought about how differently the stop could have ended if he hadn't been a commander, if he hadn't known his rights perfectly, if Webb hadn't arrived and recognized who had been stopped. And those thoughts reinforced his commitment to using his position and experience to create change that would benefit not just officers but all citizens who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race. The Toyota Camry sedan Richardson had been driving when stopped remained his vehicle for 4 more years until he finally replaced it, not because of any negative associations with the incident, but simply because the vehicle had reached high mileage and needed replacement. But he never forgot the experience of sitting in that car, being interrogated by a rookie officer who had made assumptions based on race about who could legitimately drive a modest sedan through an upper middle class neighborhood at night. The memory of those 22 minutes informed every decision Richardson made as a commander about stop policies, bias training, and accountability systems, transforming a personal moment of injustice into a catalyst for changes that would eventually benefit countless motorists who would never know their chances of being stopped without justification had decreased slightly because a commander had used his own experience of racial profiling to demand accountability and reform.